Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. I can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. Welcome to the first seminar of KNOMAD. We have today a book launch that was in preparation for a few years now, and it has a wealth of information, and it is going to be presented by one of the prominent researchers, experts on the topic of migration. And the book is about rural to urban migration, but it is global in scope. And it is really a pleasure for me to welcome Professor Lucas to make the presentation. I wanted to start with a word about KNOMAD. KNOMAD is a Global Knowledge Partnership for Migration and Development. It is a multidisciplinary brain trust for the global community. And the focus is on policy, evidence-based policy making. And it is a knowledge initiative. So there is a wealth of information that is posted on KNOMAD website. And this book is one of the flagship publications. It's a joint publication with the Oxford University Press. And glad to see that the book is out and you are the first one to get a glimpse of it. The book is available for purchase from various places. I won't advertise any of them, but you can look it up. Migration is a natural part of development. And whenever there is development, and by that, if you understand that some parts of the world are growing faster than other parts, then people would naturally move from lagging regions to the sort of leading regions. And it's really an intricate, intimate part of development. And because of that, internal migration is very, very large. It's a normal way of life, and that's why it is very, very large. And by most counts, internal migration is about 3 to 4 times the size of international migration, which is more restricted, as we know. And yet, surprisingly, there seems to be more definitive data-based analysis, evidence-based analysis on international migration than internal migration. So this is one of the efforts now, this book, which is an effort to bridge that gap to some extent. So the way this session would flow now, we have about 75 minutes now, more like 70 minutes, and we would have the book presentation by Professor Lucas for about 25 minutes. And then we will have a panel discussion for about 21 minutes, 7 minutes each for the 3 eminent panelists. And then we will have some time for Q&A. So with that, let me invite Professor Lucas to make the presentation.
First, thank you for inviting me, and a big thanks to Dilip and KNOMAD for supporting the work on this book. I was told I have 25 minutes to summarize a 700-page book, so I can only hope to give a flavor of some of the contents of all of this today. So why? The book examines why does crossing the rural-urban divide in developing countries matter? First, the headcount ratio of poverty is much higher in rural areas than urban areas. Second, there has been a long-standing debate about efficiency of these migrations. Arthur Lewis claimed too little rural-urban movement occurs. The Harris-Tadaro model indicates there is too much, while Alwyn Young argues that the process is perfectly efficient as it is. Third, migration can split families with profound effects on family life. And fourth, 87% of developing countries report policies to limit or even reverse rural-urban migration. Is this justified? The book attempts to both review prior literature and to present fresh evidence. Previous contributions have been constrained by data availability. Most of the extant evidence on internal migration addresses inter-regional transfers, not movements between the rural and urban sectors. The part that does look at rural-urban migration is rarely based on nationally representative data. In just 2 countries, Mexico and China, have dominated the empirical work. I assembled a new database for present purposes, covering 36 African countries, 24 in the Asia-Pacific region, and 15 in Latin America and the Caribbean. It draws on IPUM censuses, LSMS, DHS, and some specific surveys. The result is nationally representative observations on individuals' migrations, characteristics, and those of fellow household dwellers. A large number of potential sources had to be examined, rejecting many as inappropriate. Altogether, this left well over 30 million observations. The wall analysis is entirely on a country-by-country basis. Of necessity, the contents selected for our database vary by year of observation and level of development. Accordingly, Chapter 3 describes the background and situation of each country involved. The gross lifetime and 5-year flow migration propensities are calculated for men and for women, from rural to urban areas and in the opposite direction. From these, net rural-urban migration propensities are also tabulated, as well as in-migration rates to rural and urban areas. Similar measures are developed separately for children, but more on that later. Alwyn Young, in his 2013 paper, used the DHS data to look at adult, rural-urban, and urban-rural migration since childhood location. He concludes that, quote, about 1 out of every 4 or 5 individuals raised in rural areas migrates to urban areas as a young adult. Surprisingly, it is also true that 1 out of every 4 or 5 individuals raised in urban areas migrates to rural areas as a young adult, end quote. This paints a fascinating picture of symmetry between rural-urban and urban-rural migration propensities. Our evidence shows that the same thing in the DHS data, based on original location during childhood, but not for the measures based on birthplace. So here, the top 2 graphs for rural-urban and urban-rural moves are based on DHS data. Mean in both is about 20%. The bottom 2 graphs adopt place of birth as origin. The mean urban-rural migration propensities are significantly lower since birth than since childhood. We shall return to a likely explanation later. The horizontal axis in each graph shows the level of urbanization. Rural-urban migration rises with urbanization, while urban-rural movements decline. So symmetry does not hold in any individual country, irrespective of how origin is defined. Indeed, our computations confirm that net rural-urban migration is virtually ubiquitous, though Iran proves an exception to almost all patterns. Does this imply that rural-urban net migration is responsible for reported growth in urbanization? So think of a context where a settlement is defined as rural if it has less than 20,000 inhabitants. The village has a population of 19,900 in one census. Natural population growth adds 200 by the next census. And urbanization increases by 20,100 without anyone moving. This is called reclassification, which also occurs as city expansion swallows nearby villages. Descriptive accounts in China, Indonesia, and Uganda suggest reclassification may be an important contributor to urbanization. Calculations prove possible in 22 countries in our data. So in the figure shown here, net rural urban migration is in orange, green is natural population growth, and gray is reclassification. Net rural urban migration accounts for less than half of urban expansion, except in Cambodia on the left, where Phnom Penh was reduced to a ghost town by the Khmer Rouge, so that any urbanization had to result from rural urban arrivals. Reclassification accounts for more than half of the urban expansion in almost all of these countries. Several types of evidence are presented in the book pointing to high rates of rural-urban-rural return. One approach is illustrated in this graph for Zambia, showing the rural-urban lifetime migrants by years since arriving in town. The orange line is from the 2000 census. The blue line is from the 1990 census, shifted right by 10 years. Those at 10 years on the blue line had just arrived in 1990. If they stayed in town, they should all be there 10 years later, but they are not. Similar graphs are found for other countries too. Where panel data are available, it is demonstrated that return is not a reflection of failure, but rather returning to rejoin a family left at home after target saving. These panel data also show rising incomes with duration in town, more so for the less well-educated, which is disputed in earlier contributions. The better educated do well from the start. So this graph shows age of return from rural-urban migration in Kenya. Similar graphs appear for 16 countries. The peak age of return is 20, which is identical to the peak age of arrival, again suggesting short stays. But the 16 country profiles are generally bimodal. These are children born in a rural setting, migrating into town, then returning at a young age. This is probably why urban-rural migration from place of childhood appears substantially greater than from place of birth, as noted earlier. Some of the prior literature claims high rates of return upon retirement, notably in Africa, but this does not show up in our data. I'll leave you to read it, but I do love this quote from Berliner. Just a handful of surveys ask about such multiple moves, revealing that one move is the norm and more than two moves are quite exceptional. Sadly, Berliner is not confirmed on this quote. Step migration from village to town to city is frequently depicted to be standard. The DHS data distinguish towns from cities as destinations, revealing that such step migration is actually quite rare, most village to city moves are actually direct. The gender balance in migration matters for a number of reasons listed here. The graph shows this balance: rural-urban and urban-rural lifetime moves. Men are more likely to quit a rural area for town than are women in sub-Saharan Africa, but the reverse holds everywhere else. Women are more likely to leave an urban birthplace for the countryside than men, except in East Asia and Latin America, where there is little gender gap. The stigma attached to autonomous migration by women has frequently been noted in the literature, though with little analysis of how this actually relates to outcomes. This graph presents estimates from logic migration equations on rural-urban lifetime migration by women. Two types of women are analyzed. The horizontal axis shows the odds of never married women moving relative to married women. The vertical axis shows the odds of separated and divorced women moving. A value larger than 1 indicates a greater likelihood of migration by these single women than if they are married. It is certainly not true that all African countries, which are shown in blue, exhibit low rural-urban migration by single women. Within Asia, the portion of never married women, rural-urban migrants, living alone stretches from over 70% in Malaysia to less than 1% in Pakistan. In Africa, the range is from 60% in Botswana to less than 6% in Egypt. Latin America is more uniform and has the highest percent of never married women, rural urbans living alone. By the way, single men in Latin America tend to remain home with mom. The efficient sorting model depicts rural-urban migration, leaving the more highly skilled in town, where jobs demand better education and skill levels, while urban-rural migration relocates the less skilled to rural areas, where agriculture is less skill-intensive. I must say an Australian farmer friend of mine did object to this depiction of agriculture. Positive selection on education in rural-urban migration has long been recognized and is certainly reaffirmed in our data, with, yet again, the notable exception of Iran. More recently, negative selection on education in urban rural migration has been indicated. This is clearly not clearly supported in our data. However, rural-urban migration is actually lowering education levels among urban adults, and urban-rural migration is raising education levels among rural adults, despite the selection effects. This simply reflects the overwhelming numbers of poorly educated persons in rural areas and vice versa. Selection is not leading to sorting. The efficient sorting model also assumes no barriers to prohibit costs to migrating. Inferring barriers from the literature relating migration propensities to land and credit access is problematic. Having land and credit available may help finance a move, but land also deters departure to work one's own land, while lack of credit promotes relocation for target saving. Tests on separability in farm production and off-farm work typically indicate limited options, but any connection with migration is rarely made in that literature. Gravity models firmly establish distance as a deterrent to moving, and this is reaffirmed in our data. Interestingly, these fresh estimates reveal no decline in distance as a deterrent across countries with higher GDP, perhaps suggesting that financial costs of moving may not be the constraint. To reassess any barriers to migrating, the Tunali switching model is adopted in the book. Using this, income gains to moving prove extremely large for those who actually move from rural origins into towns or cities. The potential gains for gone are also very large for those who stay in rural areas. These potential foregone gains are exceptionally large for the disadvantaged with little education, for those living remotely at greater distances from major cities, and for ethno-linguistic minorities, though this is less clear for religious minorities. Altogether, this indicates that barriers to crossing the rural-urban divide are very real for many who lose out in consequence. Positive correlation is well established between migration now and the size of a social network at destination, created by prior migrants from the same origin. The definitions of the relevant network and of the origin vary substantially in the literature. Of course, correlation does not prove causality. But positive correlation would be observed if migrants today and those moving previously to establish the network simply come from a lousy origin. Any correlation would then be spurious. To pursue this issue, past local rain at origin is used as an instrumental variable. The results are consistent with a causal association, though typically with a somewhat smaller effect. A number of explorations exist disaggregating networks in various ways. Our data permit re-examining several of these in a wider set of countries. Let me just mention two examples here. First, does a network in one city help to lower costs of migrating to another city? Most existing studies of both international and internal migration assume so. One study in Thailand demonstrates that diversity of network destinations diminishes subsequent moves. Looking across 66 countries, this diversity effect proves weak and mixed, raising doubts about the conventional hypotheses about the cost-reducing role of networks. Instead, this may indicate a demonstration effect from the general success of urban migrants and the opportunities offered by more diverse options. Second, Professor Iverson and his co-authors have proposed an alternative mechanism underlying the role of networks. The central idea is that prior migrants vouch for KISS and KIN as employees. I believe this is supported by the finding in our data that a network has a bigger effect on further migration of the less well-educated, whose reliability may be less easy to observe. But Professor Iverson will expand on this, I believe, in a few minutes. Ethno-linguistic and religion minorities prove to exhibit less rural-urban and more urban-rural migration. This is the case both on average and controlling for such factors as more remote locations or lower education. Put this in context, Chapter 4 provides an account of each community's background, their primary location, history, political involvement, and any restrictions on their movement. A larger network of one's community at destination is shown to encourage rural-urban migration. A larger network of this community at origin actually discourages departure. Community support and familiarity matter at both ends. Beyond economic analysis, the book also looks at the impact of rural-urban migration on family life, including separation of couples. Younger, better educated husbands are more likely to be living apart from their wives. On average, across countries, 13% of rural-born married women in rural areas have no husband present, most likely having migrated. Separation proves highest in Africa, at least in the Asia-Pacific region. But separation of married couples is endemic to individual societies. Analysis of this topic is, however, complicated by the reporting of far more married women and men in most countries. Think about that for a moment. Does conjugal separation prove temporary? As already noted, returns to one's village to rejoin a spouse does prove common. Among migrant couples now together in town, on average, 2/3 move together. But among the remainder, the delay in joining can take several years. Moreover, after the wife joins the husband in town, it appears common for the husband to move on. In our database, child rural-urban migration proves fairly common. This is not simply following a father into town. Half of the rural-urban migrant children have no father present. In some countries, living with no relatives at all is not uncommon, both for boys and girls. The frequency of children left behind by migrant parents has been a focus of research on China. More generally, our data show that, on average, across countries, 1/3 of rural children have at least one parent absent. In sub-Saharan Africa, this exceeds a shocking 40%. The impact of this on education of children has been examined largely in China and in the context of international migration from Latin America, predominantly looking at paternal migration alone or remittance receipts, but not both. In our database, the treatment effect of maternal absence from a rural home is negatively associated with schooling of both boys and girls, an issue that's been controversial in the literature. Absence of the father typically proves positive. Absence of both parents is particularly harmful, especially if the extended family has not stepped in to care for the child. On average, rural-urban migrant children are better educated than their rural stayer counterparts, especially if they migrated at a younger age. Though these rural-urban migrant children never quite catch up with the urban born. Those living without any relative present do especially for education. Returning to economic issues, are rural families impoverished by members out-migration, as sometimes suggested? Panel data on 7 countries permit looking at this, showing that the increase in consumption per capita over time is indeed larger the more members who leave. Any disruption effect on income generation at origin is apparently more than offset by remittance inflows. Let me end with a couple of words about policies and the future. As noted at the outset, almost all developing countries report policy aims to restrict or reverse rural-urban migration. It is not entirely clear what is meant by this. A wide gamut of policies affect rural-urban movements, ranging from draconian registration schemes and slum clearance to trade policies that shape the terms of trade between agriculture and manufacturing, to public sector pay and educational provisions. Ministerial coordination on these policies is generally non-existent. Nonetheless, the intent is there, motivated by concerns for pressure on urban infrastructure and the political threat from disaffected urban populations. This intent ignores the concentration of poverty in rural areas and the inexorable process of structural transformation out of agriculture into industry and modern services. So can we speculate on future outlook? During the COVID pandemic, the rural sector has offered an important escape route, as it did during the East Asia crisis. This role is unlikely to disappear in the near future. Attempts to restrict and deter rural-urban migration deny access to growth at center, particularly for the disadvantaged who face barriers to moving anyway. Climate change, which is making incomes from agriculture increasingly unreliable, is unlikely to be reversed and perhaps not even slowed. If unabated, growing violence in rural areas of some regions will exacerbate this picture. The reality needs to be recognized that increasing urbanization will proceed. It is then critical to plan for the required infrastructure and its role in decentralizing from the megacities. The reality that in-migration is actually lowering skill levels of the urban populations also needs to be recognized in shaping urban employment generation. Yet, 40% of countries in Africa and the Asia Pacific region are still in the process of developing any national urban plan. Thank you. Philip, back to you.
Thank you, Bob. I have to take a breather, take a deep breath to absorb all that you said. Such a wealth of data and information and interpretation. We have 3 eminent panelists and not a lot of time. So I would now like to move on to the panel discussion part of it. I would like to invite now Suzanne Martin, the first panelist, and I think she also wrote a blurb for the book. Suzanne Martin is Donald Herzberg Professor Emerita from International Migration in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She was a founder and director of Georgetown's Institute for Study of International Migration. And prior to that, she was also the executive director for the US Commission on Immigration Reform. And also to add that she is a former chair of the climate-driven migration thematic working group of KNOMAD. Susan, over to you, please.
Thank you, Dilip. It's a pleasure to be here. I had the distinct pleasure of being a reviewer of Bob's book and having had the chance to look at it pre-publication. And I must admit, when I started to read it, I was absolutely overwhelmed. This book is an encyclopedia written by one person that deals with just about every aspect of internal migration globally and quite deeply in the individual regions and sometimes the individual countries. I wanted to say a little bit in my few minutes about three main issues. The first is the treatment of gender and family. The second is the issue of climate change, and the third is COVID and its impact. I've worked for many, many years on issues related to women and migration, as well as women and displacement. And I found the book to be extremely encouraging and unique in many ways in terms of its very comprehensive dealing with issues surrounding gender, sex aggregated data on just about every issue were drawn out. And what I particularly liked was that these issues, and particularly the migration of women, was not delegated to relegated to a marginal issue within the book, but they were front and center and integrated throughout the book. And that's very refreshing because that doesn't often happen. Of course, there are problems in terms of scarcities and paucities in data on that are sex disaggregated. So not every issue can get full treatment, and Bob raises many of those situations. What I found interesting was that some of the findings paralleled those of other studies, and the literature review of previous research in this area is extremely valuable. But then using the new database that Bob has put together, he does identify a number of areas that defy the conventional wisdom. I particularly like the attention he gave to the autonomous migration of women, and then also to the impacts that they have on families. Women appear in the volume as active, autonomous players. They're not just the following to join male migrants, although obviously that's also a big part of the question. What it led to me was, though, the need for a lot more studies and analyses that do focus on women as autonomous migrants and understanding more the issues. As with almost all quantitative research, and I'm somebody who does qualitative research, although trained in statistical analysis, I'm always a little bit nervous when we get to the issue of the difference between and what's causal, what has actually caused behavior. I think the quantitative data requires a lot more speculation about what's behind the correlations that are shown, and Bob is extremely honest in talking about when he's in that realm of speculation. But we need more qualitative data analyses and information to back up some of the what are likely causal factors, but not really determined through the data. Let me turn quickly to climate change, area I deal with a lot, and was very pleased to be involved in the 2 volumes of the Groundswell report that the World Bank has put together. And as the chair of the KNOMAD working group, I had a prominent role to play in the formation of the study and the review of it. And that indicates that the net additional migration that will occur, particularly in the absence of better mitigation of climate change and in the absence of improvements in sustainable development, are quite significant. The book doesn't really allow for teasing out in most cases what the environmental factors are that may underline some of these movements. But it does call for the need to really take a volume like Groundswell and then work through what the issues of rural to urban migration are today. And then getting back to Bob's final point, the need for governments to start treating this issue as not just a problem, but potentially an opportunity that they should embrace. And we need to get the discussion of climate mobility back into where it started about 20 years ago, about 15 years ago, in thinking of it more in terms of adaptation and how we can help people better their condition. And that leads to my third point, which is COVID. The book was finished just before the pandemic began. We know now that there have been some changing patterns of migration internally as a result, as well as internationally, as a result of the pandemic. And I think the kinds of analyses that Bob has given in this paper, in this book, really need to be extended into trying to understand what the short, medium, and long-term impacts of COVID will be in terms of rural-urban and urban-rural migration in the context of not only this type of shock, but some of the changes that may be longer term and have a much further impact. But congratulations, Bob. This was a phenomenal book, and I definitely recommend it for everyone to look closely at his findings. Thank you. You're muted, Philip.
Thank you, Susan. I would like to now invite Vegard Iverson to speak. Vegard is a professor of development economics and head of the Livelihoods and Institutions Department at the Natural Resource Institute in University of Greenwich. I hope I got that right. He is also a non-resident senior research fellow at the UNU Wider in Helsinki and at the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation in New Delhi. Vegard, over to you.
Thank you, Dilip. And thank you very much for this invitation and opportunity to briefly comment on what, as Susan says, is a very, very, very impressive and a fantastic treat, really, as a sort of as a read and for anyone who's passionate not only about migration but also about development economics and any challenge related to development. It is very impressive. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is to, just as Susan did, make a small selection of exciting new perspectives and findings. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, Bob has already spoken about some of the issues and findings around social networks, but I'll elaborate a little bit. I also want to speak briefly to some of the findings on upward mobility and career trajectories of rural-urban migrants. And then the fact that he brings in this lower and upper tail of the migrant age distribution, which is unusual, and which means that there's extensive coverage in his work of children as migrants, which is very exciting and also really, really important. And then I'll say a few words about ethnicity and religious identity towards the end. Okay, so let me start with this issue around networks in the migration process, and how that, in my opinion, affects urban labor markets, and how we need to think about opportunities that arise for rural-urban migration, which is sort of feeds into his discussion around barriers to migration. And if we look at the lower end here of the skills distribution, lower unskilled jobs in urban labor markets, he finds support for social networks being particularly important for such jobs. And a conventional interpretation here is to think about social networks as providing job vacancy information, which then typically reduces the search costs for migrants. And then there's a sort of paper by Waba and Seno, which has been quite influential, which argue that illiterate, semi-literate workers can't read job ads and have problems with other information access, and therefore benefit disproportionately from networks during the job search process. Now, one could argue here that there are two insights, I think, about the functioning of labor markets that often are overlooked, not in this book though. The first is based on some work, very important work that industrial anthropologists did, and is very articulately synthesized in Mark Holmström's Cambridge University book, a press book that dates back as early as 1984, but which is very good in its account of labor markets in the Indian context, and indicates that some anthropologists at least may have a better understanding of incentives in the workplace than many economists do. So this precedes the pioneering work of Bandiera, Barangay, and Rasul by about 2 decades. These economists have been doing very influential work on social incentives. And if you take social incentives into account in how employers recruit, then the recruitment process all of a sudden looks very different. The other thing here relates to sort of the opportunity to compare some of the challenges that employers face in recruiting migrants who come from rural areas, because there are huge information constraints here. And if you look at data from the US back in the 1920s, or you go back further back in history, there are often sort of huge problems around discipline, turnover rates, productivity issues, and so forth, which also actually resonate with a nice op-ed that Blattman and Stefan Durkin wrote in New York Times, based on some, to them at least, very surprising findings on Ethiopian factory work, and where the notion in the book around impermanence and sort of fluidity, and the fact that workers may not sort of be migrating and stay for a lifetime, but rather sort of for shorter periods, resonates well with this perspective as well. So what Professor Lucas does is to use data from 34 countries. He's tackling these endogeneities issues around network size, and also find that the overall size is important, but also the point he pointed out himself around dispersion and dispersion not being a disadvantage. The size of the network doesn't have to be in the same destination, and that's an interesting finding in its own right. And one implication here then of what I've said, and if these arguments are correct, is that you would then return to sort of an old argument around migration chains and persistence over time, which I think there's in this South Asian context in particular, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that this remains really important. And this question then that Bob also raises around new technology and how that might relax some of these access restrictions, and also changing roles for intermediaries, which we see a lot of in South Asia at the moment. Okay, so that's the sort of the first bit. Briefly on the next one, upward mobility. Very interesting again to engage with this question about whether slum dwellers get stuck and whether they're sort of informal towards formal routes. And he does provide evidence here using panel data where these selection and nutrition issues are very carefully addressed, which they must be, which point to overall rising standards of living, but a diminishing rate for urban migrants. And also, I think one should add here that that's clearly a lot we don't know, simply because the panels that we work with, when we look at this type of intergenerational mobility, are not granular enough and detailed enough about job changes and the type of occupational status that people move between. So there's clearly, a huge scope for doing really interesting work around this in the future as well. On children as migrants, again, very interesting, really important. What I find sort of particularly stimulating here is that it also opens the door for looking into intergenerational educational mobility as a result of urban migration, and where you sort of, so what he looks at is at school attendance among children who are migrants, comparing those with children who stay behind in rural areas, and find that there is progress when you move to the city, but also that there's not entirely full catching up for the with the children who are urban born. Wanted to briefly mention here some work that Alessin and others have done on intergenerational educational mobility in Africa, where there's a sort of an additional perspective that comes in here, and which draws on work that Raj Chetty and Hendren have done on the US and mobility, intergenerational mobility in the US, and where this exposure to different types of neighborhoods really matter for the long-term outcomes that you're looking at. So rather than sort of thinking about destinations as destinations in general, and as urban destinations, there's clearly sort of heterogeneity here that one could look into in much more detail, and which would also sort of expand the scope of analysis. And just one last sentence here. So from this sort of work that Alessina and company did, and it's an econometric paper in 2021, an extra year spent in a high mobility region before the age of 12 after age 5 significantly raises the likelihood for children of uneducated parents in this case to complete primary school. So there are similar perspectives, but there's scope for doing a little bit more of nuance playing around based on the age that children move and the duration of their exposure, and also the nature of the exposure that they get, which makes this, I think, potentially even more interesting, but that's an issue sort of for future work. Really. I leave it to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vegard. Now I would like to invite Rajan. Irudaya Rajan is a chairman of the International Institute for Migration and Development in India, a new institution. And he is also the chair of the KNOMAD thematic working group on internal migration and urbanization, which sort of sponsored this study, this book. Yes, over to you, Rajan. I don't want to take too long. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Dilip. Of course, you can hear me well.
Yes, we can hear you.
Let me start saying that, as already Dilip mentioned, as a current chair of the KNOMAD thematic working group on internal migration and urbanization, I am very pleased to be part of this book launch, Crossing the Divide, Rural to Urban Migration in Developing Countries, done under the umbrella of KNOMAD, published by Oxford and written by Professor Lucas, one of the authoritative and influential researchers on migration issues. I enjoyed reading the book. It is too big book, 700 pages. Some of you have not seen the book, it is 700 pages. And I would like to pick up probably 3 points, which I would like to little bit elaborate and probably end up with that. When I go through the book, something very stuck to me was that the Robert Lucas, cleverly using the existing data to understand internal migration, And in fact, in chapter 2, the authors refer to the data on rural-urban distribution, not on internal migration. And I quote what he says, the Center for International Earth Science Information and Network reports the total rural and urban population of 232 countries in 1990, 2000, and 2010. So you have so much data on rural and urban, but urbanization, when you discuss, migration is one of the important components, but we have very, very little data on migration. And then when it comes to the internal migration, there are other users, data from 136 sources from 75 developing countries. I think that is something, the whole argument for the book. Whatever he has done in this book is basically based on the sources. And the sources he has used, like unconventional sources. Look at it, 38 micro-census data, 28 living standards measurement survey, 54 demographic and health surveys, which is used for studying demography, and 16 country-specific surveys. And using all this information, they end up with 75 countries he's talking about in this book. But when it comes to some discussion, I was looking at 3 discussions. If you look at 3 discussions which he discussed extensively in the book, re-examine the income incentives and barrier to relocation analysis, these 75 countries comes to 44 countries. That means the information required is coming down whenever he does some analysis, not 75. When he talks about network issues, it comes to only 34 countries. When he talks about urban, rural, return migration and women, it comes down to 54 countries. That means even the countries he started up with 75, there are some analysis, he comes down to 44, comes down to 34 and 54 countries. Now, when you read the book, in the beginning, he mentioned even today's presentation, Mexico and China have dominated a large portion of the empirical research on internal migration. And I was indirectly what Professor Lucas is indicating to all of us working on internal migration, the non-availability of data on migration to do research on migration and pinpointing all of us to invest time and resources to conduct large-scale migration survey globally under the NOMAD. I think that indicates that still the database is a big issue to study migration. Let me take the example of India, because he says India, not much research has been done on internal migration. If you look at it, now the current estimate during the COVID-19 in 2021 is close to 600 million internal migrants. People who are living in a place they are not born. But then if somebody wants to look on internal migration for India, what data you have in this country, in India, which is the biggest country? The last census was conducted in 2011, and then there was no data on internal migration available till 2016. 5 years, they have not even released the data. Since 1881, India successively conducted census over the last 140 years, every 10 years. But what happened in 2021? The census was not conducted in India in the name of COVID-19. Of course, I know in India, I'm sitting in India, elections were conducted last year. Elections are being conducted this year, but then the database on internal migration is nothing, nobody talks about that. And you can think of another data, what is called the National Sample Survey. The oldest survey what we have is 2007-8. That means last 10 to 15 years, you have nothing to hold on, which we have seen during the COVID-19. I think the importance point is that the importance of migration data, I think we have to concentrate, we have to do global migration surveys or the country level migration surveys. I think that is going to be an important contribution. This book is telling to all of us to open our eyes on the important database. I think this is something Professor Lucas is coming out very clearly why lot of research is not happening on internal migration compared to international migration. I think this is a big question mark. I think we have to look at it, and it will continue to haunt us how to improve the database on internal migration. 2 small issues I would like to pick up. One is we always talk about return migration, especially in the international migration. We have a lot of studies on return migration, and there's a chapter Professor Lucas devoted for return migration. In fact, he talks in his chapter. He says, I am aware of only 2 studies on return internal migration. 2 studies on return internal migration. And he writes in the chapter, the unpermanence of moves, return and onward migration. He talks about 2 countries, Peru and Tanzania. That indicates again what I was talking, to look at return migration, which is not discussed in the literature on internal migration. And I think we have to congratulate Professor Lucas for taking this return migration as an important issue to understand internal migration. And the final point is, which we talk too much in the international migration, is social cost of migration, especially the families left behind. He has devoted the full chapter on impact of migration upon families. He talks about leaving the wife and children. He talks about children education. Only thing I felt it was missing was what happened to the elderly parents when the adults are moving out of the villages. There are villages in some of the areas, maybe the old people might be sitting alone. So I think what happened to the elderly parents, I think something probably we should look at it. What happened to women? What happened to children who move with the parents, who left behind, and also the women who move with the husband and left behind, and the elderly parents who are in their sunset years, not able to see their children and grandchildren because of the internal migration. I think something one should look at it. To conclude, I think this is the book should be must read by anyone in the world who is interested in mobility and migration. Thank you very much, Dilip. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajan. I would like to now request Bob, in case you want to make any comments, or we can move to the Q&A. That's also okay if you want to take questions first from the audience and then you want to group, but you want to come in now?
I'm happy to take questions more generally and come back, because I think we're going to be short of time for questions from other people otherwise.
Yes, yes, and thank you, Bob. I think that's a good idea. I was also thinking that just for everyone, I mean, we are okay to go 5 minutes more, just because we have not had enough time. So any questions, please raise your hand, or please raise your hand. That's the best way to do it online. I don't see any hands here. I'm not able to see any hands, meaning that probably there isn't any. So there you go. Then perhaps you should start.
Cam Wing Chan asked to be unmuted.
Oh, you want me to unmute people? I mean, it's already unmuted, I think. Please unmute if you want to speak up. It's okay to speak up. No, I don't see any hands, which is great. So, Bob, I think everybody likes what you are saying. So, I think that's that. I actually wanted to. I was struck by, there's so much to digest and so many directions one can, so many pieces of evidence that each of them is a huge issue in itself. One fact that struck me, and in hindsight is not surprising, is your statement that 87% of countries or governments restrict internal rural-urban migration. I think that's something like that you said. That is not surprising, and yet it raises some very interesting questions. In the context of international migration, we often talk about social contract between the state and the people, and this country is mine, this is my identity, whatever. So that's the argument they make. What kind of argument can one make in the context of restrictions on rural-urban? Other than the congestion issues, infrastructure issues that one might face in the urban centers. So that is one query I had. I mean, any thoughts on that? And the second one is more a comment. I noticed that there wasn't much discussion of recruitment costs that are involved in recruitment of workers. And most of the internal migration, even more so than in the case of international migration, is probably economic migration. It's a statement to be checked. But the refugee movements are just about 4% or 5%, 6% at the most of total international migration. Similarly, internal displacement is very small, 40 million, or depending on how you count it, 60 million perhaps. That's the range, 60 million out of 760 or 800 million. So the question is, in the case of countries like India or even China, when urban centers need workers, there is a recruitment process from the rural areas, and there are huge financial costs as well as other costs. And there wasn't much discussion of that. You know that there is a SDG indicator on international migration on reducing worker paid recruitment costs. There must be similar thing going on in the case of internal migration as well. There might be a need to reduce abuses and recruitment costs paid by migrant workers themselves. Just a comment on that. I mean, I know maybe it is not the right place to talk about it, but I thought that was an important discussion to have. And now I see a couple of hands. First one is
Yeah. Isn't it nice?
Matlub Piracha first, and then Lara White after that, and then Ron Skeldon. Great to see you, Ron. So you are the third one. Matlub, please.
Hi, Bob. Good to see you after all these years. Very, very nice, very impressive. I've actually looked at a couple of chapters a couple of weeks when you sent the email to kind of inform me about the book. Very interesting work. Just couple of things I wanted to ask you is just your thoughts. I think you have covered, may have covered some of those, but incomplete information kind of is one of the key, or one of the issues in a way in international migration. Incomplete information in terms of migrants not having a full understanding of the labor markets in the destination countries. To what extent that plays a role in internal migration? I know there's, the cultural and informational aspects are different, but to what extent, especially in a country like China and possibly India and big countries like that, and then how much is that kind of related to the aspect of return migration? One of the things that we see possibly is the migration, the failure, so to speak, of the migration project. You migrate, you don't realize, the information, patches of information might be there, but you don't realize the return from migration, and then the return from migration. So then there's a return back to the rural area, so to speak, because of the lack of the return from migration. So how much does that kind of information, and it slightly kind of relates to what Dilip was talking about. Sorry, Dilip, I'll finish. It's slightly relate to what Dilip was talking about in terms of the contract from the employment perspective as well. So it's kind of both employer and employees kind of information barrier. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Matlub. I realize there are a couple of questions also on the chat, and in particular, Christian Luke from the World Bank, Luke Christiansen, has a question, and I won't read it. I'll read it later. And then Philippe de Corte, who is Philippe de Corte, is the co-chair from UN Habitat of the KNOMAD thematic working group on urbanization. So he also has a question. I won't repeat that now. I'll first go to Lara White. Keep it
Thank you, Dilip.
brief.
It's very brief. It's actually building off of your question on restrictions for internal mobility, and I'm wondering, because we had done with IOM some comparative analysis of internal versus international migration in the context of Myanmar, and I was just wondering if in your work, if you have encountered, because of any kind of internal restrictions for mobility, if this then impacts international mobility and reduces opportunity for international mobility. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. Ronald Skeldon, please.
Oh, thank you, Dilip. Thanks, Bob. It's great to see you, and congratulations on the publication of what's obviously a formidable book. I haven't seen it yet, although the journal for which I'm one of the editors, Population Studies, I know has approached the publisher, and we hope to have a review in our journal sometime this year. So I really can only comment on the title, Crossing the Divide, which is a rather nice title. It's going to sell. But to what extent is that divide real? Doesn't this rural-urban migration blur the divide? It's a very porous divide. And what the urban areas are doing is extending their influence into the hinterlands through these systems of circulation. One of the previous speakers raised the issue of return. But this question of regular circulation, which would not be captured in most of data gathering instruments, is really there, and that the city becomes part of the livelihood strategies of rural areas, and therefore this divide may not be quite as real as implied in the title. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Ron. Great to see you. So Luke Christiansen had this question on the chat function, basically asking the importance of distance and its consequences for urbanization and broader development policies. So you talk about distance and what are the implications for urbanization and broader development policies. That's Luke Christiansen's question. And then Philip, Philip Decorte talks about, is asking a question. First, highlighting that it is really important to focus more and more on the family dimension of migration, not on the individual, but on the family, and do the current way to analyze data, the way we collect data, allow us to understand that better. So those are two questions. So you have the three panelists' comments, plus mine, plus we had 4 or 5, actually 6, I think, total comments. So I know you wouldn't have time to respond to all of them, but whatever your parting words, but one thing is clear, that everybody thinks it's a great book. So over to you, Bob. Unmute. You have to unmute. Yes.
Can you hear me now? Good.
Yes.
Good. A lot of people are mentioning data. It's an issue I wrote about several decades ago, about improving collecting our data both for international and internal migration. And unfortunately, there's been very little response from various people who have made suggestions on how we can improve the data. A couple of countries are, if you do manage to get to see a copy of the book, you'll realize there is very little on China in the whole book. The reason is that I could not find any data that are accessible to foreign researchers that do a useful way of dividing between urban and rural areas in China. It's quite amazing. The consequence is that the range of estimates of how much rural-urban migration has actually happened in China are all over the place, massive gaps in the projections on that. Duref mentions the Indian data. I gather that the census data do actually ask place of birth, but the national sample surveys do not, which severely limits, since most of us can't get access to the census data, severely limits what we can do in terms of research on India. One huge gap, and I know Dilip is very concerned about this, remittance data are pretty pathetic in all of these sources, which limited what I could do in terms of looking at the role of remittances. For example, when I said that the absence of a father is positively associated with the education of the children, if I controlled for whether or not the family received remittances, then the father's absence actually does show up as negative. It is the fact that then remittances are sent back that matter in this. On someone, well, in a way, Ron, I think, touched on this issue, straddling the divide is the term I would use, that a lot of what we're putting down as return migration of families splitting, one or two members going into town, supporting the family back home. So the family ultimately is straddling this divide. But I think there is a pretty sharp divide in living standards between the people in town and those left behind in the villages. One reason that I suspect we're seeing a lot of this splitting of families is it is simply cheaper to leave your family back in the village, especially if you've got a large family. So one member goes, they then remit to support the family back home, perhaps intending to return to the place of origin. Vegard mentioned the issue of intergenerational mobility. I've written on that, but not in developing countries, but actually on Finland. It's actually a project I'm hoping to pick up on using some of these same data. There are two kinds of mobility here. Mobility in the sense of migration and social mobility. And the link between the two does not seem to have been systematically investigated either in developing or even in the high-income countries. And I think it's a very important topic that we need to take up. Lara, I'm afraid I don't have very much I can offer you on the issue of restrictions leading to effects for international migration. These surveys don't do a very good job at all the censuses, of picking up international migration. Some of the surveys do ask, have you ever lived abroad? But you can't usually see who from the family is currently living abroad. So we can't really build on those connections. You can certainly in some contexts, and I think I comment in the book on this, in the context both of Namibia and South Africa, that the former restrictions have indeed had continuing impacts on the internal migration and settlement of people even today. So I'm sure I'm missing many points that were raised. Lack of information. Yes, certainly, Matlub, I think an important issue. It's difficult to pick up on that through data collection. Asking people what information did you have is a little difficult. An interesting study that has never been published by Michael Clements and a couple of his co-authors. They gave cell phones to some villagers and not to other villagers. And from the villages where they gave cell phones, migration into towns increased substantially. They could get information a lot more quickly about job openings and feedback from their friends in town, and that increased the migration, suggesting that information is indeed quite critical in this. Thanks, Dilip.
Thank you, Bob. There were still some questions from Sona Kalantirian from European Commission on female empowerment, effects of migration, and sectoral diversity. So I'll forward those questions later. You don't need to answer, that's what she says. And I also see a question from Susan, can't pronounce it, Chu, I suppose, pronunciation, Susan Chu, I think. And I'll again, there's something relating to China. I'm not going to read it. I'll forward that to you. So we will see if there is a way we can respond directly to them. So Susan, if you are able to send your, Susan Chu, if you are able to send your contact details, I think we have it, that would be great. And Sona, we have your contact details. So with that, now we are heading to 12:30 almost. So I would like to conclude now by first thanking all the panelists and most importantly, thanking Bob Lucas for all the hard work and working on it for so many years. It takes a lot to get to analyze 75 countries, household survey level databases. Each survey analysis could mean a PhD thesis or maybe many PhD theses, and you have done 75 of them. So thank you very much, and congratulations. Also, thanks a lot to Oxford University Press for publishing this. And I'm really proud on behalf of KNOMAD and our donors, European Commission. When the book started, Sweden was part of it. Also SDC from Switzerland and BMZ from Germany for their support to KNOMAD, which then allows for such big, important activities that are not easy to undertake otherwise in a normal funding setting or academic setting. So it's all been a great pleasure to have you all from all over the world. And we will have more presentations on this book. I think if Bob agrees, we will figure it out. And thanks to the panelists again, and particularly to Susan and Rajan for their involvement with the KNOMAD in the past as well as now. And behind the scene, a number of other colleagues were involved. I'm not going to mention them, but I want to say that we are going to post the recording of this session on the website, so it would be available for others. And next time we will have probably more focused discussion of various aspects of internal migration that this book brings about. So thank you all once again, and let me stop now. Be well.
Thank you.
Excellent.